I-review lang natin yung grounds for liability to pay damages. There are 4 grounds for liability to pay damages, and they are fraud, negligence, delay, and contravention of the tenor of the obligation. This is Article 1170 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. Diniscuss ko last time yung fraud. This is otherwise known as deceit or dolo. This time, in this video, I'm going to discuss the second ground for liability to pay damages, and that is negligence. Negligence is otherwise known as fault or culpa. What is the meaning of negligence? Negligence is the omission of that diligence which is required by the nature of the obligation and corresponds with the circumstances of the person, of the time, and of the place. This is Article 1173 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. It is the failure to observe for the protection of the interest of another person that degree of care, precaution, and vigilance which the circumstances justly demand, whereby such other person suffers injury. It is the omission to do something which a reasonable man, guided by those considerations which ordinarily regulate the conduct of human affairs, would do, or the doing of something which a prudent and reasonable man would not do. As you can see, ang dami-daming sinasabi sa definition, pero ang ibig sabihin lang naman ng negligence ay kapabayaan. It's the failure to exercise and observe the diligence required in an obligation. The question is, what is the diligence to be observed by the debtor in the performance of his obligation, in order for him not to be negligent? If the law or contract does not state the diligence which is to be observed in the performance of the obligation, the debtor must observe the diligence of a good father of a family, as required by the nature of the obligation, and which corresponds with the circumstances of the person, of the time, or of the place. Meaning to say, ang diligence na i-observe ni debtor ay diligence of a good father of a family. Take note, it's not diligence of a father of a good family. It's not good diligence of a father of a family, but rather diligence of a good father of a family. Unless sinasabi sa batas o pinag-usapan ng dalawang parties, si creditor at debtor, na merong specific diligence. Kung sinasabi sa batas or pinag-usapan ni debtor or creditor na ganito yung diligence, then yung diligence na i-observe ni debtor ay yung nakasaad dun sa batas or dun sa pinag-usapan ng dalawang parties. Let's have examples. If the obligation is to deliver a specific window glass, the debtor must ensure that the glass, considering its fragility, is well protected, say with cushions, when he transports it as required by the nature of the obligation. Otherwise, he will be negligent. Ang obligation ni debtor dito sa example ay to deliver a specific window glass. Of course, yung specific window glass ay babasagin. It is prone to damage. Pwedeng mabasag yung specific window glass during the delivery. That's why obligation ni debtor na lagyan ng cushions. Let's say for example, kailangan niyang lagyan ng styrofoam or bubble wrap or plastic foam para nga hindi mabasag yung specific window glass. Pag hindi niya ginawa yon, then he will be considered negligent. Another example, a babysitter, 21 years old, strong and healthy, will be negligent if she sleeps while on duty, considering that the circumstances of her person were considered when she was hired for the job. Of course, the babysitter should take care of the baby while on duty or while working. If the babysitter sleeps while on duty or while working, then she will be considered negligent. Next, another example, if the driver of a car drives at night without any headlight, he will be considered negligent considering that the circumstances of nighttime require such light. Of course, needless to say, kasi gabi yan, kailangan talaga ng headlight. Kung yung driver, nag-drive siya sa gabi without having headlight, then that driver will be considered negligent. Next, if the same car driver drives at 50 kilometers per hour along a busy street where many people are crossing, he will be negligent because the circumstances of the place require that he should drive slowly. Of course, since ang daming tao na dumadaan doon sa kalsada, it is the obligation of the driver to drive slowly. Kung ang bilis ng sasakyan ay 50 kilometers per hour, then the driver will be considered negligent. Yung first example, that is an example of the diligence of a good father of a family as required by the nature of the obligation. Yung second example, that is an example of the diligence of a good father of a family which corresponds with the circumstances of the person. Yung third example, that is an example of the diligence of a good father of a family which corresponds with the circumstances of the time. At yung fourth example, that is an example of the diligence of a good father of a family which corresponds with the circumstances of the place. Let's now proceed to the kinds of negligence. There are three kinds of negligence, and they are: first, culpa contractual or contractual negligence; second, culpa aquiliana or civil negligence or tort or quasi-delicts or culpa extra-contractual; and third, culpa criminal or criminal negligence. Unahin natin yung culpa contractual or contractual negligence. Culpa contractual or contractual negligence is the negligence in the performance of a contract. In culpa contractual or contractual negligence, there is always a pre-existing contractual relation. Meaning to say, there's a contract between the parties involved. In culpa contractual or contractual negligence, the master-servant rule applies. Applicable ang master-servant rule sa culpa contractual or contractual negligence. Ano ba yung ibig sabihin ng master-servant rule? Ang ibig sabihin nito, yung negligence ng servant ay negligence ng master. That means, if the servant is negligent, then the master is also negligent. Pwede rin nating sabihin na yung negligence ng employee ay negligence na din ng employer. If the employee is negligent, then the employer is also negligent. Yun yung ibig sabihin ng master-servant rule. Accordingly, the defense of a good father of a family in the selection and supervision of employees is not a defense on the part of the employer, although it may mitigate the liability. So, ang ibig sabihin nito, hindi pwedeng maging defense ng employer yung diligence of a good father of a family in the selection and supervision of employees para makatakas siya dun sa liability niya na dapat siyang magbayad ng damages. Hindi niya pwedeng maging defense yon para hindi siya magbayad ng damages. Yung burden of proof na kay employer. That means, ipoprove ni employer na in-exercise niya talaga yung diligence of a good father of a family in selecting and supervising his or her employees. The word mitigate here means lessen. That means yung defense of the diligence of a good father of a family may lessen the liability of the employer. Let's have an example. The negligence committed by the driver of a bus when a passenger is hurt during a trip because there is a breach of contract of carriage. As you can see in this example, there is a contract, and that contract is a contract of carriage. Recall that in culpa contractual or contractual negligence, the master-servant rule applies. Therefore, the negligence of the bus driver is also the negligence of the bus owner. Next, culpa aquiliana or civil negligence or tort or quasi-delicts or culpa extra-contractual. These are acts or omissions that cause damage to another, there being no contractual relation between the parties. This is Article 2176 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. Actually, itong culpa aquiliana, na-discuss ko na to during the sources of the obligation. Di ba merong 5 sources of obligation and they are law, contracts, quasi-contracts, delicts, and quasi-delicts. Yung quasi-delicts, tinatawag din yon as culpa aquiliana. In culpa aquiliana, there is no pre-existing contractual relation. That means there is no contract between the parties involved. In culpa aquiliana, the master-servant rule does not apply, meaning to say, the negligence of the servant is not the negligence of the master. Or we can say that the negligence of the employee is not the negligence of the employer. Hence, the defense of a good father of a family in the selection and supervision of employees is a defense on the part of the employer to escape liability. In other words, the defense of a good father of a family in the selection and supervision of employees is a proper or complete defense of the employer, in order for the employer to escape liability. Let's have an example. A pedestrian is hit by a bus through a reckless driving of the driver. As you can see in this example, walang contract yung pedestrian at driver. So the negligence of the driver is culpa aquiliana or civil negligence. Therefore, the negligence of the driver is not the negligence of the owner. Next, culpa criminal or criminal negligence. Culpa criminal or criminal negligence is the negligence that results in the commission of a crime. Meaning to say, this negligence is the cause why there is a crime. In culpa criminal or criminal negligence, the defense of a good father of a family is not proper because the employee's guilt is automatically the employer's civil guilt if the former is insolvent. Meaning to say, kapag insolvent ang employee, automatically yung employee's guilt ay employer's civil guilt. That's why the defense of a good father of a family is not a proper defense of the employer. Take note of this. In culpa criminal, defense of a good father of a family is not a proper defense. Also, in culpa contractual, defense of a good father of a family is not a proper defense. Pero sa culpa aquiliana, defense of a good father of a family is a proper defense. Let's have an example. The passenger of the bus may bring a court action not only for culpa contractual against the bus owner, but also one for culpa criminal against the bus driver for reckless imprudence resulting in physical injuries. So, yung pasahero ng bus, pwede siyang mag-file ng case against the bus owner for culpa contractual. Kasi nga, merong contract between the passenger and the bus owner. Pwede rin siyang mag-file ng case for culpa criminal against the bus driver for reckless imprudence resulting in physical injuries. Kasi nga, yung negligence ng driver, yun yung dahilan kung bakit nagkaroon ng physical injury. The negligence of the bus driver is the cause why there is a crime. And that crime is physical injury. In the same way, the pedestrian may bring not only a suit for culpa aquiliana against the driver and the owner, but also one for culpa criminal against the bus driver for reckless imprudence resulting in physical injuries. So, pwedeng mag-file ng case si pedestrian laban kay driver at bus owner. Of course, for culpa aquiliana. Kasi nga, walang pre-existing contractual relation si pedestrian sa driver at sa owner. Pwede rin siyang mag-file ng case for culpa criminal against the bus driver for reckless imprudence resulting in physical injuries. Kasi nga, yung negligence ng bus driver, yan yung dahilan kung bakit nagkaroon ng physical injury. The negligence of the bus driver is the reason why there is a crime. And that crime is physical injury.